I know there's Worcestershire sauce, however you say it, Worcestershire sauce, Worcestershire sauce. Hi folks, it's Darcy and welcome back to the Purposeful Pantry. Today we're going to talk about the do not dehydrate list, the ultimate list of what you can and cannot dehydrate. And we're going to start this out by using the guidelines from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. That's the safety guidelines that I follow on my blog, in my home, and on my Facebook group, Dehydrating Tips and Tricks. We want to make sure that we're following the safest standards for doing dehydrating in our homes. You may choose to do something different, and that's okay with you. But what this is for, especially for beginners, we want to learn the best and safest guidelines for doing home food preservation with dehydrating to make sure that we don't make our families sick. So now let's talk about the National Center for Home Food Preservation, how they work. And excuse the neighbor who decided to start doing his yard work right when I needed to record. They test everything from canning to freezing to cooking to dehydrating and make recommendations about what's safe and what's not based on science. However, they have not tested everything, and they can't because their budget doesn't allow it. So if they've not tested it, they cannot recommend it. Not recommending is not the same thing as not safe. So we're going to start there, and as we talk about these things, we'll talk about whether it's recommended or not based off if it's been tested versus if it's recommended just because we've never done it. You can make your decisions from there. And granted, these guidelines are not what are used worldwide because not everybody follows these standards, but that's how we're going to start from today. So we're going to start with the premise that there are three things that make dehydrating certain foods not a great idea. One is fats and oils. That's the biggest one because fats and oils go rancid over time, especially after they've been heated. So if your product contains a lot of one or the other, or both, depending on what it is, because oil is technically a fat, but not all fats are oils. So we're going to start with that premise that if it contains a lot of fat or oils, it's not safe to dehydrate. And what I mean by that is while it may be safe to dehydrate, it's not necessarily going to be safe for storage for long term because it will go rancid fairly quickly for some things. And why ruin your work? Those things, if you decide to go ahead and dehydrate, should be stored in your freezer after. Number two is that there's no safe testing available. We've talked about that just before, about how the National Center for Home Food Preservation can't test everything. Some things you can kind of extrapolate from science if it's safe or not, but for the most part, if it's not been tested, they cannot recommend its safety. And number three is salmonella. Salmonella issues come from not being able to keep dairy, meat, and eggs at a safe temperature as to not to cause problems over time. So because your dehydrator cycles on and off, it doesn't stay at a solid temperature that's safe at whatever food you're choosing to dehydrate. And with vegetables and fruit, it doesn't matter because it's going to keep them heated to where they need to be. But for proteins of any kind, you need a safe temperature. So because your machine cycles, that's a problem. And your machine takes a little while to get up to that temperature. And even if you preheat your machine, once you open it, you lose a lot of that heat. So that's why many foods are considered not safe because of salmonella. Of course, you can make your own decision for your family and your family's needs. Now, if I start mentioning some of the foods on the list that we're going to talk about in a minute and you do them at home, this is not a judgment on you about whether you've done it. This is just to present the safest standards for dehydrating. So don't assume that these are judgments. Don't read that into it because that's not what I'm doing. Okay, so let's get started. We're just going to walk down the list of all the things that you cannot dehydrate and then talk about each of them. You can choose what to do from there. Eggs are probably one of the things that you'll get the most blowback from everybody if you say yes or no either way. Eggs are not dehydratable. But salmonella is the big issue. And if you dehydrate your eggs and you don't get them fully cooked to the temperature where they need to be safe, you risk exposing your family to salmonella and creating food poisoning and being sick. You don't want that. If you choose to dehydrate eggs, you must cook them fully to the temperature of 165, and because off the top of my head now I've forgotten, I'll put that up here, but you need fully cooked eggs that you cannot store on your shelf for long-term food storage because they have been deemed not safe for that. You can store them in your freezer. However, if you'd like an alternative, freeze-dried eggs are available commercially from a number of purveyors, August Farms, Emergency Essentials, and I'm sure there's lots more of them out there. So you can do that to have shelf-stable freeze-dried eggs for your pantry. Now, dairy plays into a whole lot of things. You've got milk cheese, yogurt, and all of the different variations of that across the board. Dairy is not safe for dehydrating at home or long-term shelf storage. Okay, that just pretty much wraps all of it up. You will have people who dehydrate milk. You will have people who decide to do their own dehydrated cheese. That's their choice. But if you're taking the safest route for dehydrating, do not dehydrate dairy. Milk is available commercially. Cheese is available commercially. Yogurt, sour cream, available commercially that you can then reconstitute to make your own dry mixes, etc. Meat is, next to eggs, one of the most contentious things about dehydrating, about whether or not it's safe. Beef jerky is perfectly safe to do. The problem becomes storing it long term. It needs to be stored in the freezer according to the National Center for Home Food Preservation. That means that you can make your beef jerky, you can keep it for a couple of weeks, and then you need to store it in the freezer because it just will not stay on your shelf safely over time. The fat is the problem. It's going to turn rancid, and then you've ruined your beef jerky. So don't do that. Put it in the freezer. It doesn't hurt to put it in the freezer. It's not going to kill anything, and that's the best place for you to store it. However, doing things like raw chicken shouldn't be done for human consumption. You should cook your chicken first, and it's recommended that you pressure can your chicken or use commercially canned chicken because that turns out to have a better texture after. Doing fish, turkey, venison, beef, any of those are very specific. There are some very specific guidelines that you need to follow. I'm going to link down below a website that you can go check out. It's called Jerkyholic. They have great safety tips for doing jerky. I can tell you how to do it, but they do it much better than I do. So that's where you should go. And then remember, always store in your freezer later for the best long-term food storage. If you are a master jerky maker and understand the curing process and know that you're safe in your curing, by means, make your jerky and keep it on your shelf. But if you're not that, keep it in your freezer for the safest food storage for long term. You'll be happy that you didn't waste your jerky because meat's really expensive and you don't want to waste it. All right, so let's get on to some specific foods like avocados. Avocados are not viable for a dehydrator for the most part because the fats are the issue. It's ruining a perfectly good avocado, and why would you want to do that? You can freeze avocados in a number of ways, and I'll drop, my husband is in the background going, go ahead, ruin it, because he hates them. Freeze them. That's the best way to preserve them. And I'll drop a description, I will drop a link in the description box below to teach you how to freeze avocados correctly. Olives can be dehydrated safely. The problem is the fat and the oils that you have to deal with that make them not shelf stable. But you can dehydrate them. I know a lot of hikers like to put them in their trail mixes because it helps increase their sodium when they've been sweating out on the trail, and they taste really good and pungent and are just a different kind of treat. So dehydrate your olives, cut them in half, make sure that you've got them open so that they can get fully dehydrated. Then store them in your freezer. They are not going to be shelf stable. Nuts. A lot of people like to soak nuts in order to boost the nutritional value of them and then dry them before storage. You cannot dehydrate a nut to extend their food storage. Nuts have oils. Nuts have to be stored in the freezer for the best long-term storage. However, if you do go a traditional food route and decide to soak your nuts, you can dry them out in your dehydrator, but they still need to be stored in the freezer for the best long-term food storage. Peanut butter would be awesome if we could dehydrate it because you take up so much of your shelf stock with peanut butter jars. And if you could dehydrate it all down and get it into one jar like I can do with pumpkin or with tomato paste, it would be awesome. But unfortunately, you can't because the amount of oil in there is just tremendous. So instead, don't even bother messing up your dehydrator. Just go get some peanut butter powder. It's great. It's been done commercially where they extract the oils kind of like you do with olives for olive oil. They extract those oils, then commercially dehydrate the peanuts, then create a powder from that is mostly fat-free and is available to keep on your pantry shelf for a very long time. I've got a post down below that I'll link down below that teaches you all the ways that you can use peanut butter powder in your pantry. Breads. Breads are safe to dehydrate. However, just like everything else that contains any oils or fats, it will not be great for extreme long-term storage because eventually that grain and the fats will go rancid. So dehydrate your bread. Don't add oil to it to make croutons unless you're going to eat those within the next few weeks. But if you're doing it for long-term storage, just use your bread, put some seasoning on it, dehydrate it, and store it. Same with breadcrumbs. Don't use additional oils. So go ahead and do your breads and your breadcrumbs. Just make sure that you're tracking them in your food pantry to make sure they haven't gone rancid before you use them. You may get 6 months, you may get 12 months. It just depends on the particular bread that you're using, what the ingredients were in it, and how you're storing them. They are safe, but be aware they may turn over time. Oh, condiments are a hit and miss. The issue is always the fats and the oils, but then on this one, it's sugar as well. And it's not because sugar is unsafe to dehydrate, but once you've dehydrated sugar, it's so attracted to water that when you powder it, it can cause a lot of clumping. So that you'd want to mix things in like arrowroot powder or anything to help stop that clumping. But with most condiments, it's the oils and the fats that are in them that make them unavailable for dehydrating. I wouldn't say safely, but conveniently. It just makes them unavailable for great dehydrating because the storage after is the problem. So you can do things like dehydrate tomato sauce or tomato paste, powder it, and then make it into a ketchup later. You can do mustard as long as you haven't added oil to it, but I'm not sure how that would turn out because I've not tried that one before. I know there's Worcestershire sauce, however you say it, Worcestershire sauce, Worcestershire sauce, any other number of way that you can say that one. That one can be dehydrated, but the problem is that you have to sit and simmer it to a syrup, then dry it till it's brittle, then you powder it, and you're left with very little. But there's commercial options available for you if you'd rather do that, because it does take some time to get it to that point where you can use it, but it is doable. So, are there foods that I didn't list that you are still curious about? Please leave your questions down below, and I'll pin at the top comment all of the questions asked and answers for it so that you don't have to search through. However, be kind. We all do things a little differently, and you may be doing something that I don't agree with. I may be doing something that you don't agree with, but there's no need for unkindness. So just keep the conversations civil and helpful to each other. I would love to help you figure out what's the safest thing for you to do in your home and get you dehydrating more food to stock your pantry. I also am going to list all of the resources that I used in the comments in the description box below for my blog post that lists these foods plus some of the other references. So, thank you for watching. Happy dehydrating, and I'll see you next time.